The wind was a sculptor of miseries, carving the grit of the redemption settlement into every exposed surface. It scoured the raw lumber of the auction platform and whipped dust into the eyes of the listless crowd, a fine, ochre shroud for a town that breathed despair. On the edge of this gathering, a woman stood apart, wrapped in a silence as profound and unrelenting as the vast, indifferent sky. Ilara had not spoken a word in the 2 years since the fever had taken her husband, Thomas, and their infant daughter, leaving her voice buried with them in the hard-packed earth of their homestead. Her grief was a physical presence, a weight in the hollow of her throat that had long since stolen all sound. She had come to town for flour and salt, a necessary pilgrimage from her isolation, but found herself tethered to this cruel spectacle by a morbid, inescapable gravity. The auctioneer, a man whose sweat-stained shirt clung to his corpulent frame, was selling off the assets of a failed ranch, livestock, tools, a wagon with a broken wheel. Then, the final lot was brought forward. 3 children, their hands bound loosely with rope. They were Apache, their dark eyes holding the terrible, ancient wisdom of trauma. The auctioneer cleared his throat, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. "Last lot of the day," he boomed, his voice grating. "Found wandering near the Mescalero skirmish. No kin to be found. Healthy enough for work, I reckon," he gestured dismissively. 3 savage whelps. Mute as stones, the lot of them. Won't make a sound. What am I bid for the indenture? A murmur rippled through the crowd, a venomous hiss of prejudice and fear. "Savages," a woman whispered, pulling her own child closer. "They'll slit your throat in the night," a man muttered. The children stood unmoving on the block, a triptych of defiance and terror. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 10, stared straight ahead, his small jaw set like granite. A girl, younger by a few years, watched the crowd with an unnerving, intelligent stillness, her gaze missing nothing. The youngest, a little boy who couldn't be more than 5, clung to her leg, his face buried in the folds of her ragged tunic. They were a single, silent entity of shared fear, their muteness a shield against a world that had offered them only violence. Ilara felt a tremor in the deadened landscape of her soul. She saw not savages, but echoes. She saw the fierce, desperate protection in the oldest boy's stance, the watchful burden in the girl's eyes, the sheer, helpless terror of the smallest. They were orphans of a storm, just as she was. The auctioneer tried again, his frustration mounting. $5? For 3 sets of hands? They're quiet, I told you. No troubles. The silence that answered him was colder than any winter wind. No one wanted them. They were refuse, the human debris of a brutal conflict, destined for a workhouse that was little more than a prison, or to be scattered to fates too grim to contemplate. The auctioneer raised his gavel, ready to declare them property of the territory, a problem to be disposed of. In that moment, something shifted in Ilara. A flicker of warmth, faint but undeniable, against the permafrost of her sorrow. It was not a thought, but an impulse, a current that moved through her limbs before her mind could protest. She took a single step forward, out of the shadows of the general store's awning. Her movement, so small, drew every eye. She raised her hand, her fingers slender and pale. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply met the auctioneer's gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a sound of pure shock. The auctioneer's eyes widened, his jaw slackening for a moment before snapping shut in a greedy grin. He had not expected a bid, least of all from the silent widow of redemption, a woman who was herself a ghost haunting the edges of their community. "Sold," he barked, slamming the gavel down before anyone could object or question the sanity of the act. "To the widow Abernathy. For $5. The transaction was a blur of cold formality. Ilara untied a small leather pouch from her belt, her hand steady as she counted out the coins. They were worn smooth, the last of the money Thomas had set aside for a new plough. She placed them in the auctioneer's sweaty palm, her gaze never leaving the children. The rope that bound them was cut, and they were shoved forward, stumbling at the edge of the platform. They huddled together, their dark eyes fixed on her, not with gratitude, but with the raw, animal suspicion of the perpetually betrayed. The townspeople stared, their judgment a palpable force. They saw a fool, a lonely woman making a dangerous mistake. Ilara saw only the tremor in the smallest boy's lip and the defiant terror in the oldest stare. She turned without a word and walked toward her waiting buckboard wagon. She did not look back to see if they were following. She simply started walking, her posture erect, her pace measured. For a long moment, the children remained frozen, a small, desolate island in a sea of hostile faces. Then, the little girl, Nita, took the small boy's hand and gave a slight tug. The oldest, Tarza, cast one last defiant glare at the crowd before nudging his siblings forward. They followed Ilara at a distance, their bare feet silent on the dusty road, like shadows clinging to a fading light. The journey to her homestead was conducted in a silence that was layered and complex. It was not the companionable silence she had once shared with Thomas, nor the hollow, aching silence of her grief. This was a silence of walls, of deep, untrusting chasms between them. The children sat huddled at the very back of the wagon bed, as far from her as they could get, their bodies tensed for flight. Ilara kept her eyes on the tired mule swaying back, the familiar rhythm of the creaking wheels a strange counterpoint to the wild, uncertain beat of her own heart. "What have I done?" The question was a silent scream in her mind. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude, built to contain her pain. Now she had willingly breached her own defenses, inviting in 3 fragments of a world she knew nothing about. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and bruised purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Her homestead came into view as they crested the last rise, a small, sturdy cabin of hewn logs, a curl of smoke from a banked fire rising from its stone chimney. It stood alone in a shallow valley, cradled by low, rolling hills, the only sign of human life for miles. It was her sanctuary and her prison, and now, it was to be theirs. When Ilara stopped the wagon, the children did not move. They watched her unhitch the mule and lead it to the small corral, their eyes following her every action with an unnerving intensity. She moved with an economy born of habit, her body knowing the chores her mind barely registered. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in the soft, grey light of twilight. The cabin door stood open, a rectangle of faint, welcoming warmth against the encroaching dark. But the children remained in the wagon, a united front of resistance. Tarza's arms were crossed over his chest, his small frame rigid. Nita held the youngest, Kale, close, her hand stroking his hair in a gesture of primal comfort. Ilara understood. The 4 walls of a white man's house were not a symbol of safety to them, they were a cage. She did not call to them or try to coax them out. Instead, she went to the woodpile, gathered an armful of split pine, and built a small fire a safe distance from the cabin and the wagon. The flames caught quickly, spitting sparks into the darkening sky, a beacon in the vast emptiness of the plains. She went inside and returned with 3 tin plates and a small iron pot of rabbit stew, its savory aroma cutting through the crisp night air. She set the pot near the fire to warm and placed the plates on a flat stone, ladlefuls of stew steaming on each. Then, she retreated. She took her own plate and sat on the cabin's porch steps, leaving the fire and the food to them. She ate slowly, her gaze directed toward the distant silhouette of the hills, granting them the dignity of her apparent indifference. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a coyote. Ilara finished her meal, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The folly of her act settled upon her. They would run. By morning, they would be gone, and she would be alone once more, the silence of her home even more profound than before. Then, a shadow moved. It was the little one, Kale, his small body trembling. Driven by a hunger that outweighed his fear, he crept toward the fire. He snatched a piece of bread from one of the plates and darted back to the safety of his siblings, devouring it in panic bites. A few moments later, Nita followed. She moved with a deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the darkness, assessing every threat. She picked up a plate and took it back to the wagon, where she and Kale shared it, their heads bent close together. Only Tarza remained, his pride a formidable fortress. He stared at Ilara, his eyes glittering in the firelight, a silent challenge. Ilara held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of his strength, his role as protector. Finally, his own hunger won out. He moved with a swift, angry motion, grabbing the last plate and retreating to the shadows to eat alone. They did not enter the cabin that night. Ilara left the door ajar and went to her own cold bed. She lay awake for hours, listening to the alien sounds of them settling in the wagon, their soft rustles and imagined whispers filling the void her own child had left behind. The first week was a fragile truce negotiated without words. Each morning, Ilara would rise before dawn, light the fire, and leave food for them. She would go about her chores, milking her single goat, tending the small vegetable garden, mending worn clothes, always aware of the 3 sets of eyes watching her. They were like wild deer, poised to bolt at the slightest unexpected movement. Kale was the first to soften. He was a creature of simple needs, and Ilara's consistent provision of warmth and food began to erode his terror. One afternoon, as she was weeding the carrot patch, he toddled over and watched her, his thumb in his mouth. He pointed a small, grubby finger at a bright yellow wildflower growing amongst the vegetables. Ilara paused. She gently plucked the flower and held it out to him. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward his siblings, who watched from the porch. Then, with a sudden lurch, he took the flower and ran back to Nita, clutching it like a treasure. It was a beginning, however small. Nita was the observer, the strategist. Her silence was not one of fear, but of calculation. She watched how Ilara kneaded dough, how she stitched a seam, how she checked the sky for rain. One day, Ilara found her by the creek, meticulously washing the tin plates from their morning meal, imitating the motion she had seen Ilara perform countless times. She did not look up as Ilara approached, but a faint blush colored her cheeks. Ilara simply left a bar of lye soap on the rock beside her and walked away. A silent thanks, a silent acceptance. Taza was the hardest. He remained a bastion of anger and suspicion. He saw her not as a savior, but as a captor, another link in the chain of white people who had destroyed his world. He refused to participate in any chore, spending his days exploring the edges of the property, his movements lithe and restless. He tested her boundaries, venturing further each day, always watching to see if she would try to stop him. She never did. She let him have his freedom within the small valley, understanding that caging him would only fuel his rage. Her silence, which the townsfolk saw as a mark of strangeness and sorrow, became her greatest tool. Without the complication of language, there could be no misunderstanding of tone, no poorly chosen word to deepen their wounds. Her actions had to speak for her, and they spoke of patience, consistency, and a deep, quiet respect for their own silence. The emptiness of her home began to change. It was no longer the echoing chamber of her own loss, but a space filled with a new, tentative life. The scuff marks of their bare feet on the floorboards, the sight of 3 small figures huddled by the fire, the wildflower Kale had pressed between the pages of an old book, these small things began to knit themselves into the fabric of her days, stitching over the raw edges of her grief. One morning, a shadow fell across the porch where Ilara was shelling beans. She looked up to see a man standing there, so still he seemed to have materialized from the air itself. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn buckskins, with a face weathered by sun and hardship. His dark hair was long, and his eyes, quiet and perceptive, missed nothing. It was Elias Thorne. He was a trapper, a man who lived on the fringes, trusted by neither the settlers nor the tribes, for he carried the blood of both. Thomas had traded with him, respecting his knowledge of the land. Elias had not been seen near the homestead since Thomas's death. He nodded once, a curt gesture of greeting. His gaze drifted to the 3 children, who had frozen mid-motion by the corral, their eyes wide. He looked back at Ilara, a question in his eyes, but he did not voice it. He held up a string of freshly caught rabbits. "Too much for one man," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, a sound unused to conversation. Ilara stood and took the rabbits, her hands brushing his. A jolt, subtle but distinct, passed between them. She nodded her thanks, the gesture carrying the weight of a full sentence. He lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the homestead, the repaired fence line, the well-tended garden, the children. He saw the way Tarzan instinctively moved to place himself between his siblings and the stranger. He saw the watchful intelligence in Nita's face and the way Kale peeked out from behind her. He saw Ilara, her silence no longer seeming like pure grief, but like a deep, placid strength. "The coyotes are bold this season," he said, his gaze sweeping the hills. "And not all predators walk on four legs." It was a warning, plain and simple. He was aware of what she had done, and he understood the danger. He touched the brim of his hat and was gone as silently as he had arrived, melting back into the landscape from which he had emerged. The rabbits were a gift, but his presence was something more. It was an anchor, a quiet acknowledgement from the outside world that she was not entirely alone in her endeavor. That night, as the smell of roasting rabbit filled the small cabin, which the children now slept in, huddled together on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, Ilara felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. It was not hope, not yet. But it was the possibility of it, like the first pale light of dawn after a long, starless night. She was building something here, in the silence and the solitude. A life, fragile and strange, pieced together from broken parts. And she would protect it, with a ferocity she was only just beginning to discover in herself. Slowly, a rhythm took root in the valley. The passing weeks were marked not by days on a calendar, but by the steady progression of shared tasks. Ilara began to purposefully teach, not with words, but with demonstration. She would take Nita's small hands and show her how to card wool from their single shaggy sheep, her own gentle movements guiding the child's. Nita proved a quick study, her nimble fingers soon mastering the task, a look of quiet pride on her face as she produced a soft, fluffy bat of wool. Ilara showed Kale how to scatter feed for the chickens, and his initial fear of the birds gave way to a solemn delight as they flocked around his feet, pecking at the grain he offered. He would look up at Ilara after, a wide, toothy grin his only comment. Tarzan remained the challenge. He held himself apart, a sentinel of their former life. When Ilara tried to show him how to split kindling, he dropped the axe and walked away, his back a rigid line of rejection. Ilara did not press him. She simply finished the task herself, leaving the pile of kindling neatly stacked. But she saw him watching from the woods, his eyes narrowed in concentration, absorbing the lesson even as he rejected the teacher. The true breakthrough with Tarzan came not from a chore, but from a storm. The sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a bruised, malevolent gray in the space of an hour. A violent thunderstorm rolled in from the plains, the wind shrieking like a banshee and the rain coming down in blinding sheets. A bolt of lightning struck an old cottonwood near the creek, splitting it with a deafening crack. Kale began to wail, his terror absolute. Nita held him, but she too was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. The wind tore at the cabin, and a loose shutter began to bang violently against the wall. Before Ilara could move to fix it, Tarzan was outside in the deluge. He fought against the wind, his small body straining, and managed to secure the shutter with a piece of rope. He returned soaked and shivering, but with a new light in his eye. He had protected their shelter. He had acted not for himself, but for them all. That evening, as the storm rumbled its way east, he sat by the fire and, for the first time, accepted a bowl of soup directly from Ilara's hand. He did not meet her eyes, but the stiff rejection in his posture had eased. He had found a way to contribute on his own terms. Ilara felt her own transformation in these moments. The gnawing emptiness inside her was being filled, not with a replacement for what she had lost, but with something entirely new. Her love for her husband and daughter had been a calm, sunlit harbor. This new feeling was a wild, fierce thing, born of necessity and forged in hardship. It was the ferocious protectiveness of a she-bear for her cubs. She was no longer just the grieving widow Abernathy. She was Ilara, the keeper of 3 silent children. Her purpose was no longer to simply endure her own survival, but to ensure theirs. The arrival of Silas Croft was as jarring as a rock thrown through a quiet pool. He rode a big, loud sorrel horse that trampled the edges of her garden, his presence an immediate violation of the peace they had built. Croft was a rancher with a sprawling property that bordered her small valley, a man known for his greed and his cruelty. He saw the world in terms of ownership and power, and he dismounted with the swagger of a man who believed he owned everything he could see. "Widow," he boomed, not bothering with a greeting. His eyes, small and porcine, swept over the homestead with contempt before landing on the children, who had instantly retreated to the porch, Tarza standing before the other two like a small shield. "I heard a rumor you'd taken in some redskin trash." Looks like the rumor was true. Ilara stood, wiping her hands on her apron, her body a silent wall between him and the children. She said nothing, her stillness a stark contrast to his blustering energy. "This is my valley, woman," he snarled, gesturing with a meaty hand. "My grazing lands run up to these hills. I won't have Apache whelps squatting here, attracting others. They're a menace." His gaze fixed on Tarza. "I heard you lost some chickens last week." "Probably him. They're all thieves, born and bred." The accusation was baseless, a fabrication designed to provoke. The fox that had taken her chickens had left clear tracks. But Croft was not interested in truth, he was interested in intimidation. He took a step toward the porch. "They don't belong here. I want them gone. Send them to the fort, or I'll handle it myself." Ilara did not move a muscle, but a cold, hard resolve solidified within her. The grief that had muted her had also distilled her spirit down to its strongest, most essential form. She had lost everything once, she would not do so again. She subtly shifted her weight, her hand resting near a heavy iron skillet she'd been cleaning. Her eyes met Croft's, and for the first time, he saw something other than a meek, grieving woman. He saw an unyielding resolve, a maternal fury that was as primal as the land itself. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Croft was a man used to getting his way through noise and threats, and her quiet defiance unnerved him. "You hear me, woman?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I want them off my land." Tarza, misunderstanding the danger or perhaps understanding it all too well, took a half step forward, his hands clenched into small fists. It was the only provocation Croft needed. He lunged, his hand reaching out to grab the boy. In that instant, the world fractured. The quiet, grieving widow vanished, and in her place stood a protector. With a speed that shocked even herself, Ilara moved. She snatched up the cast-iron skillet, its weight familiar and solid in her hand, and stepped directly into Croft's path. She didn't swing it, not yet. She just held it, a dark, heavy shield between the predator and his prey. Her eyes, no longer downcast with sorrow, blazed with a cold fire. The promise in them was absolute. It said, "You will not touch him. You will have to go through me." Croft halted, genuinely taken aback by the sudden, silent ferocity. He saw the truth of her intent in the cords that stood out on her neck, in the white-knuckled grip on the iron handle. This was not the woman he thought he knew. This was something else entirely, something ancient and dangerous. "Get out of my way," he growled, but his voice had lost its blustering confidence. He was still bigger, stronger, but her stillness held a power that unsettled him. He reached for her, intending to shove her aside. But as his hand moved, another presence made itself known. Elias Thorne stepped out from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, as silent as a wisp of smoke. He hadn't been visible a moment before, yet now he stood there, a plains rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't raise it. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his quiet gaze fixed on Croft, a silent witness and an undeniable threat. Croft froze, his hand hovering in the air. He knew who Elias was. Everyone on the frontier knew of the half-breed trapper who moved between worlds and answered to no one. To face a lone woman was one thing. To face her with Elias Thorne standing at her back was another entirely. The trapper's presence shifted the balance of power completely. The odds were no longer in Croft's favor. A long, tense moment passed. The only sound was the wind whispering through the tall grass. Croft's face contorted in a mask of frustrated rage. He was a bully, and his intimidation had failed. He shot a venomous glare at Ilara, then at the children, and finally at Elias. "This isn't over," he spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He turned, yanking his horse's reins with unnecessary force, and mounted. He galloped away without a backward glance, his angry departure scarring the quiet earth. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded, the tension broke. Ilara's arm trembled, and she slowly lowered the heavy skillet. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her weak-kneed. Nita and Kale rushed to her, clinging to her skirt, their small bodies shaking. Tarza stood his ground, but his hostile gaze was gone. He looked from the departing figure of Croft to Elias, and then to Ilara. In his dark eyes, for the first time, there was a flicker of something akin to awe. Elias walked forward, his footsteps soft on the ground. He stopped before her, his eyes gentle. "He won't be back soon," he said, his voice a low reassurance. Ilara could only nod, her throat tight not with her old sorrow, but with the fierce, trembling aftermath of a battle won. The quiet that fell over the valley in the wake of Croft's departure was different. It was not empty, nor was it tense. It was a shared silence of relief, of a bond sealed in the crucible of a common threat. The children stayed close to Ilara for the rest of the day, their small orbits tightening around her as if she were the sun. Kale refused to let go of her hand, his small fingers a constant, warm presence against her palm. Nita, ever watchful, brought Ilara a cup of water from the bucket, a simple, profound gesture of care. Tarza was the most changed. The defiant anger that had been his armor had fallen away, replaced by a solemn, watchful gravity. He followed Elias Thorne with his eyes, studying the man who had appeared like a spirit to protect them. When Elias checked the perimeter of the homestead, ensuring Croft had truly gone, Tarza shadowed him at a distance, his posture mimicking the trapper's alert stillness. As evening fell, Elias shared their meal, the five of them gathered around the hearth fire. No one spoke, yet the small cabin was filled with a sense of communion. Elias showed Tarza how to fletch an arrow with a hawk feather, his large, capable hands moving with slow precision, the boy's dark head bent close to his. After the meal, as Ilara was banking the fire for the night, Nita came to her side. The girl dipped her finger in the grey ash on the hearthstone. With careful, deliberate strokes, she began to draw on the clean-swept floor. First, she drew a tall, stick-like figure of a woman. Next to her, 3 smaller figures. Then, she drew a 5th figure, taller than the children but not as tall as the woman, holding what was clearly a rifle. She looked up at Ilara, her dark eyes shining with emotion, and then carefully drew lines connecting all the figures' hands. A family. Whole and unbroken. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled Ilara's knees washed over her. Tears she had not shed in 2 years burned behind her eyes. She reached out and gently touched Nita's hair, her hand trembling. The girl leaned into her touch, a silent affirmation of everything that had passed between them. Later, as the children slept soundly on their pallet, a peace in their slumber she had never seen before, Ilara sat on the porch steps, the cool night air on her face. Elias sat with her, smoking his pipe, the scent of sweet tobacco mingling with the pine-scented air. "They are good children," he said quietly, breaking the long silence. "They have been shown much cruelty," Ilara nodded, looking out at the star-dusted sky. "You are not what people say you are, Ilara Abernathy," he continued, his voice soft. "They say you are broken by grief. But a broken thing cannot mend others." She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the moonlight. Her silence was her answer, and he seemed to understand it perfectly. He understood that her own brokenness was precisely what had allowed her to see the fractures in them, and that in the slow, patient act of mending their lives, she was finally, irrevocably, mending her own. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the next. Autumn painted the hills in hues of gold and russet, and winter draped them in a pristine blanket of white. The small, fragile unit forged in silence and fear grew strong, its roots sinking deep into the soil of the valley. The children thrived. They were still mute, the trauma that had stolen their voices buried too deep to be easily dislodged, but their silence was no longer born of terror. It was simply their way of being. They communicated with a rich and complex language of gestures, expressions, and a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. Kale's laughter, a silent, body-shaking gasp of joy became a common sight as he chased butterflies in the meadow. Nita's intelligence blossomed. She learned to read by watching Elara trace letters in the dirt, her quick mind absorbing the shapes and their meanings with astonishing speed. Tarza became the guardian of their small world. He learned the ways of the land from Elias, who became a regular, quiet presence at the homestead. The boy learned to track, to hunt with a small bow Elias made for him, to read the stories the land wrote in broken twigs and animal prints. He brought his offerings, a small rabbit, a string of fish, to Elara with a solemn pride that filled her heart to bursting. Elara herself was utterly transformed. The ghost of the grieving widow was gone, replaced by a woman of profound strength and quiet purpose. Her movements were no longer weighed down by sorrow but were filled with the steady grace of intention. Tending to her children, teaching them, protecting them, this was the work of her life, and it was a sacred work. The harsh lines of grief around her mouth had softened, and her eyes, once vacant, held the clear, steady light of love. She was no longer silent because her voice was lost to grief, she was silent because, in this small world she had built, words were not necessary. Her love was in the bread she baked, the clothes she mended, the safe harbor she provided. One evening in late spring, as the setting sun bathed the valley in a gentle, golden light, the five of them sat on the porch, watching the sky change color. Nita was braiding wildflowers into Elara's hair. Kale was asleep, his head in Elara's lap. Tarza sat next to Elias, carefully whittling a piece of wood, their shoulders nearly touching. It was a scene of perfect, ordinary peace, a peace that had been fiercely won. Elara looked at the three children she had claimed from a world that saw them as worthless, and at the quiet man who had stood with her when she needed him most. They were not a family born of blood, but one forged in the fires of hardship and tempered by a love that needed no voice to be heard. The town of Redemption still whispered about the silent widow and her savage charges, but their voices were distant now, unable to penetrate the sanctuary of the valley. Here, in this small pocket of the world, a woman who had lost everything had found it all again in the silent eyes of three orphans no one else wanted. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer alone. She was home,